Let's talk about mutations. Okay, so natural selection is a really important mechanism of evolution, but evolution can also occur by random processes, right? So you've got three main ways. You've got artificial selection, natural selection, and now we're going to talk about the random processes. In these cases, the genetic composition of a population still is changing over time, but the changes aren't related to the differences in fitness among the individuals, okay? They're random processes, okay? So we're going to talk about mutation, genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, and then something called the founder effect. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but mutations occur randomly, okay? If they're not lethal or deadly, they can add to the genetic variation of the population, okay? So you can have good mutations, but the larger the population, the more opportunities there will be for mutation to appear within it, all right? Over time, the number of mutations accumulate in the population and evolution occurs. Okay, so this example is pretty simple here, but you've got some mice, right? You're starting with 10% black and 90% white. Something has happened here, a mutation with the white mice that turns the one mice black, okay? So over time and multiple generations, that mutation might spread throughout the population and you end up with 30% black, 70% white, okay? There are all sorts of other examples of this, but this is a pretty simple one that's understandable, okay? Here's another face swap. This is so funny. Okay, let's go on. All right, another thing you guys need to know about is gene flow. All right, so it's kind of hard to see here, isn't it? But this is just showing here in this diagram. Gene flow is when genes move from one population to another, the transfer of genetic information from one population to another. So this is trying to show here two populations. You have population A, it went away when I clicked on that. Oh, there you go. And population B down here, it came back. And basically these two populations live on two different sides of this mountain. This looks like a drawing I drew, but I didn't make this. Ooh. And you can see that the red bird from the red population and the blue bird from the blue population are transferring genetic information. So you're getting a little bit of genetic diversity here with them doing that. So here we go. That's gene flow. Let's talk about genetic drift. Okay. Genetic drift is a change in the genetic composition of a population over time as a result of random mating. Okay, so like mutation, genetic drift is non-adaptive. It's a random process. So genetic drift can be particularly important in really small populations, okay, in which the random events that affect which individuals mate can most easily alter the genetic composition of the next generation. Okay, so imagine you have a population, a small population of about 5 animals, okay? 2 individuals in that small population carry genes that produce black hair, and 3 individuals carry genes that produce white hair. If by chance the individuals carrying the genes for black hair fail to find a mate, those genes will not be passed on, right? They kind of die. Just like your last name if you don't have kids. If you're the last male with that last name, your lineage is gone. The next generation will be entirely white-haired, and the black-haired phenotype will be lost. Okay, so in this situation, the genetic composition of the population is changing. All right, therefore, the population has evolved. The reason why, or the cause of why evolution has happened here, is completely random. So the failure to find the mate has nothing to do with the hair color. Okay, so this diagram is showing what I was just talking about, but it's showing how this could impact a small population compared to a large. If the population randomly loses a gene of these black-haired mice, you can see how it's changing the population more easily over time. Versus if it's a large population, the chances of that gene being lost are a lot smaller. So we'll talk a lot more about that in class. Let's go. Okay, guys, let's talk about the bottleneck effect. All right, this one's pretty simple. Basically, this is a drastic reduction in the size of a population. Okay, we call it the population bottleneck. All right, so literally just think of a bottle, like a 2-liter bottle that you're holding upside down. Something happens to a population and a whole bunch of the species or organisms in the population die. Okay, this can change its genetic composition, right? There's a lot of different reasons why this might happen, why a population might experience a drastic reduction. It could be, natural things, or it could be things caused by human, like habitat loss. It could be hunting. It could be changes in the environment. But when that population size is reduced, the amount of genetic variation present in the population is also reduced. Okay, so the smaller the number of individuals, the smaller the number of unique genotypes that can be present in a population. So a reduction in the genetic diversity of a population caused by a reduction in its size is called the bottleneck effect. All right. Low genetic diversity in a population can cause lots of different problems, including the risk of disease, low fertility, things like that. Okay. Another thing that can happen is species that have been through population bottlenecks are often less able to adapt to future changes in their environment. In some cases, when a species has been forced through a bottleneck, the resulting low genetic diversity can cause that population to decline into extinction. A lot of these declines are thought to be occurring today in a number of species. Here's a diagram showing cheetahs and how their phenotype has changed over time, or their genetic diversity. So in the beginning, this is what we had. This is showing their phenotype. 10% of the cheetahs had no spots, 50% had small spots, and 40% had big spots. So something happened, some bottleneck effect, I'm guessing, and I don't know, I could research this. Maybe y'all can look it up if you want. Probably some sort of natural disaster happened where it bottlenecked only these survivors. Okay, so you can see, if you look down here, what was left afterwards, we completely lost the trait of having no spots. So they are dead, gone, bye-bye, right? And instead of having 10%, 50, and 40, now with this new population of the survivors, we're at 0% having no spots, 33% having small spots, and 67% having big spots. So as this, leftover population continues to reproduce and stuff like that, as time goes on, you're going to keep those traits. And if something else happens that could wipe out small spots or something, in general, you're having lower genetic diversity. Okay, so that's the gist of that. Okay, so let's talk about the founder effect. Let's pretend that one male and one female of a particular bird species have been blown off their usual migration route and they have landed in a hospitable oceanic island. Okay, these two individuals were essentially drawn at random from the mainland population, okay, which is right here. And the genotypes they possess are only a subset of those in the original mainland population. Okay, so the birds that made it over here to the island, these colonizing individuals, or we call them founders, hence founder effect, are going to give rise to an island population that has a genetic composition very different from that of the original mainland population here. Okay, so such a change in population descended from a small number of colonizing individuals is known as the founder effect. All right, like mutation or genetic drift or the bottleneck effect, the founder effect is a completely random process that's not based on differences in fitness. Okay, so pretty simple. It's kind of similar to the founder effect, but it's different, right? Because you've got a situation where this population, this diversity is coming from a mainland, but it's only a portion of it. Okay, so it's not like saying these genetic traits over here have died out. They've just died out in this specific population because they weren't transferred over. Okay, but you can see how they compare, right? The mainland was about 50% red, 25% blue, and 25% gray, but we only had, and I said a different example, so ignore that. This makes more sense. 33% red, 0% blue, because all the bluebirds, they stayed over on the mainland, right? They didn't want to go over to that island. And then we got 67% gray over here. So we just got red and gray birds. All right, here we go. And let's talk about allopatric and sympatric speciation. All right, so over time, speciation, which just means the formation of a new species, has given rise to the millions of species present on Earth today, right? They wouldn't be here otherwise. So beyond knowing how many species exist, environmental scientists are also interested in understanding how quickly existing species can change, how quickly they can evolve, and how quickly they can go extinct. So we know that microevolution is happening all the time around us, right? We're breeding all these agricultural crops. We're unintentionally developing these drug-resistant bacteria. And we just talked about the bottleneck variation in the cheetah, right? But so how do we move from this microevolution, right, to the evolution of a genetically distinct species? Or in other words, how do we move from microevolution to macroevolution? Okay. One common way in which evolution creates new species is through geographic isolation. Okay, that's exactly what it sounds like. A species is isolated geographically. So like we just saw in the description of the founder effect, A subset of individuals from a larger population may colonize a new area habitat that's physically separated from the other rest of the population. For example, something that might happen in real life is that a group of birds might colonize a new island that's created by an erupting volcano. Another example might be a single large population that gets split into two smaller populations because of some sort of geographic barrier. So it could be like a river that's formed in the middle. It could be a mountain. It could be anything like that. In any of these situations, the genotypes of the isolated populations might diverge over time. It could be because of random processes, or it could be because of natural selection. Okay, so if the two separate habitats have different environmental conditions like temperature, precipitation, stuff like that, the occurrence of predators, natural selection is going to favor different phenotypes in each of the habitats. Okay, so if individuals cannot move between the populations, then over time, the two geographically isolated populations are going to continue to become more and more genetically distinct. So eventually, the two populations are going to be separated not only by this geographic isolation or this geographic barrier, but they're also going to be separated by this reproductive isolation, right? They're going to become so different that even if the physical barrier were removed, those two species could no longer interbreed and produce viable offspring, meaning two species. Okay, they're no longer the same species. So because this process of speciation requires geographic isolation, we call that allopatric speciation. Okay, so the easiest way to think of this, these two terms here, is to think allopatric speciation involves geographic isolation. There is some sort of barrier. Okay, you've all heard of the example of Darwin's finches. We're going to do a lab about that in class, but environmental scientists have determined that allopatric speciation is thought to be responsible for that. So when Darwin visited the Galapagos Islands, which is just west of Ecuador, he wrote down in his journal that there was a really large variety of finch species. But he noticed that each of them seemed to live in different habitats and they ate different foods. Okay, he did a lot of research on the birds and figured out that they could all share a common ancestor from the mainland and the colonized islands a long time ago. So I have a picture of that here in a second. But essentially, Darwin figured out that over 1 million years ago, the finches were geographically isolated on these different islands, and they became genetically distinct from each other since they were reproductively isolated. So when we're talking about how evolution produces new species or generates new species, usually we're talking about allopatric speciation. Some sort of geographical barrier is the most common way in which evolution generates these new species. It can be accidentally in nature, or it can be a result of deliberate human actions that we did on purpose, right? Allopatric speciation is the most common way in which evolution generates new species, okay, with that geographic barrier. But it's not the only way, okay? There's another term that you guys should be familiar with, and it's sympatric speciation. But this is the evolution of one species into two species in the absence of geographic isolation. So there's no barrier present. This usually happens through a process called polyploidy, meaning there's a different number of chromosomes. Most organisms are diploid and they have two sets of chromosomes. In polyploidy, the number of chromosomes increases to 3, 4, or even 6 sets. Okay. I think my dog just threw up. But anyway, as long as you guys are familiar with that and you know that sympatric speciation includes no barrier, you'll be good. All right. So make sure you read up on that in the book. Oh, what do we got? Dad jokes. Hee-haw. How do you make a tissue dance? You put a little boogie in it. Okay, so here's a picture of what I just talked about with Darwin's finches. So as you can see, if you look over here, they all share this common ancestor from the South American mainland. So it's kind of like the founder effect that we just talked about. These different finches went to these new islands, and with them, they took a certain set of genetic diversity based on what was available on those islands. Over the course of millions of years, they adapted and evolved these different traits. Okay, so you've got your ground finches. They have beaks that are good for eating seed and cactus flowers, okay? These tree finches, they are good at eating insects. So you can see, based on their beaks there, they can eat those things. The vegetarian finch, oh my God, that would be me, eats buds. And then you got the warbler finches, which would eat insects as well. So we'll do a lab in class about that, like I said. Alrighty. So you might be wondering to yourself, how long does evolution take? Well, I'm about to tell you, okay? It takes a long time. It can take hundreds to millions of years, okay? But there are 4 different factors you guys should be familiar with right here that affect successful adaptation, okay? So the first factor here is the rate of environmental change. Okay, so to survive a rapid environmental change, a population has to be able to evolve quickly. So let's talk about an abandoned coal mine, for example, right? They can produce highly acidic water streams and cause a large drop in the stream pH in only a few decades. Okay, that's happening really quickly in geologic terms, right? This dropping of the pH is too rapid for a lot of the species that live in the stream, and they're unable to adapt to it. Okay, so a lot of local species near coal mines and those streams have gone extinct under the circumstances, okay, or at least locally extinct. If the rate of that change in the acidity had been slower, more species might have adapted to the change by evolving a greater tolerance for those acidic conditions. Okay, it's just happening too fast, which was one of the main problems why so many species are going extinct today, because these changes are happening so rapidly. Okay, it's the rate of which it's happening is so fast compared to our Earth history. Okay, another factor you should be familiar with is genetic variation. Species with high genetic variation contain individuals with a wide variety of phenotypes. Okay, so their variation makes it more likely that at least some individuals will be well suited to the environmental conditions, right? So species that have very large populations across wide geographic areas, such as the white-tailed deer, they're everywhere, right? They live all over North America. They typically have the greatest amount of genetic variation. So that really high genetic variation allows more rapid evolution by natural selection. Population size is another factor you should be familiar with, because these mutations, whether they be beneficial or not beneficial, will spread more quickly in a small population. Okay, because when organisms are mating in a small population, they're mating with a larger percentage of the population than in a large population, right? The last one you guys need to know is generation time. So species that become reproductively mature in a short time tend to evolve more quickly than the species that require a long time to mature. So if it takes 100 generations to produce a change in the genetic composition of a species, then that change is going to occur more quickly if the time between generations is a few weeks than if it's a few years. This is why we can generate tons and tons and tons and tons of species of different bacteria and see evolution happening really quickly by researching that in the lab, because the generation times for different bacteria species is crazy small. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So one of the main things you guys should take away from all of these things, how evolution is occurring, is this, right? The ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions will determine whether the organism will survive or go extinct. Okay, so does it have that ability to adapt? All right, we're almost done. Almost done. I think I said that like 10 slides ago, so sorry. All right, so let's talk about the range of tolerance. So every species has an optimal environment in which they can perform particularly well. Okay, we call this the range of tolerance. All right, it's a limit to the abiotic conditions they can tolerate. Some of these abiotic conditions could include extreme air temperature, it could be humidity, salinity, pH, stuff like that. So we have a word for this suite of ideal conditions in order for a species to exist in one place. Okay, and that's the fundamental niche. All right, it's the ideal conditions for a species to live in. All right, the realized niche is the range of abiotic and biotic conditions under which a species lives. A generalist is a species that can live under a wide range of conditions. It's easily adaptable. Okay, a specialist is a species that can live only in specific habitats. These types of species are more likely to go extinct because they can't adapt quickly. Okay, so here's a riddle for you, okay? What gets broken without being held? I'll tell you all the answer in class. And that is all for our notes, okay? I hope you guys have a great day, and I will see you in class. Toodaloo!